Welcome to our video on index numbers, where we're going to look at the CPI, Consumer Price Index, and some other examples as well. Okay, so what are index numbers? Well, an index number basically provides a simple way to compare measurements that are made at different times or in different places. So for instance, the value at one particular time or place must be chosen as the reference number, and then we can compare another value at another time or place to that with the index number. The index number is just going to be the value divided by the reference number times 100. And there's no rule for rounding index numbers, but in the book that we're currently using, we'll round them to the nearest tenth. You'll have to round to whatever book you're using. Okay, let's look at some examples. Average gas prices per gallon. So in 1965, right, it was 31 cents. In 1985, it was $1.20. So price as a percentage of 1985, if you put 0.31 over $1.20, that's 25.4%. So the price index is 25.4, right? So you can see that all you're doing is you're doing a percentage and then you're lopping off the percent symbol. So that index price is really just a percentage in disguise. That's why we're talking about this now. It's just another version of a percent. Okay, so let's find an index number. Suppose the cost of gasoline today is $2.70 per gallon using the 1985 price as the reference value. Let's find the price index for gas today. So the price index number is just going to be the current price divided by the 1985 price and then times 100. So you do 270 divided by 120, which gives you a decimal. You hit that with 100, which basically just moves the decimal place over to, and you get 225. So instead of 2.25, which you would know as a decimal would be 225%, you move it over, and then that would be 225%. So the current price is 225% of the 1985 price, or it's basically 2.25 times as much, right? Because 200% is 2 times more. Okay, so, or two, I should say 2 times as much, because 2 times more would be different. Sorry, verbiage matters. Okay, suppose it costs $16 to fill your gas tank in 85. How much did it cost to buy the same amount of gas in 2015? Well, from the previous table, this one back here, we know that the price index for 2015 was 210, which means that the price of gasoline in 2015 was 210% of the 85 price. So the 2015 price of gas that cost $16 in 85 was just 210% times $16, right, equals $33.60. How about changing the reference value? Any reference value can be used to calculate an index number, but changing the reference value results in a different index number, right? Before, we were indexing everything with 1985. But we could just as easily index everything with 2005 instead. And now you can see that 2005 is the 100%, and 95, it was only 52% of what it was in 2005, right? And way back in 1965, it was only 13% of what it was in 2005. And then 2015 is only 9% more, instead of saying it's, 110% more, right? It's 210% of what it was, which is 110% more, because that's how much more than 100%. So it all depends on what your reference value is, right? Where are you comparing things to? So let's use the 2005 price as a reference value and find the price index of today's gasoline price, which is $2.70. Right, so now instead of dividing it by the price from 85, we're going to divide it by the price from 2005, and we get 116.9, or basically 16.9% higher. So as we would expect, the price index is different when we use a different reference number. Duh, right? So it's really just the same thing with a different reference, right? Are we going to compare it to 1985, or are we going to compare it to 2005? So the consumer price index is a special kind of index that's based on an average of prices for a sample of more than 60,000 goods, services, and housing costs. It's computed and reported monthly. So the rate of inflation from one year to the next is usually defined as the relative change in the consumer price index. So they're not just looking at how much gasoline costs, they're looking at a lot of things, right? A sample of more than 60,000 things, goods, services, and housing costs. So it's kind of like, the cost of living. The average cost of living in the United States is the consumer price index. And so then the rate of inflation tells us how much more it costs to live each year based on what it was before. So if you want to check out a table, you can look them up online. Our particular textbook has one on page 170 that shows the average annual consumer price index from 82 to 84. Suppose you needed 30 grand to maintain a particular standard of living in 2010. How much would you have needed in 2016 to maintain that same standard of living, i.e. be able to afford all the same stuff that you could afford in 2010? Well, you would have to look at the CPIs, right? The consumer price indexes. So the consumer price index in 2010 was 218.1, and in 2016 it was 240. If you figure out that percentage, right, that relativeness of those two, you can see that in 2016 it's 1.1 times, right, or 10% higher. So you would need 10% more money. So instead of 30,000, you could multiply that by 1.1 and see that you'd need to make 33,000 to keep that same standard of living. So it's kind of like the idea of, if you could afford to go out to eat this many times, you could afford to, own this kind of house, blah, 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 then you would need $3,000 more to have that same lifestyle. So inflation comparison, very similar, right? Find the inflation rate from 2015 to 2016. How does it compare to the inflation rate in the late 70s? Well, the inflation rate from 2015 to 2016 is just the difference in the CPI is divided by the starting point. So you're just finding a relative difference, right? So the actual difference between the two, it went from 237 to 240, so it went up by 3%. But you take that 3%, you divide it by 237%, and you get 0.016 cents, or it's basically a 1.3% change, right? And it's a positive because it went from 237 to 240, went up. So this rate of 1.3% is much lower than the rate of inflation in the late 1970s. How about adjusting prices for inflation? Well, if you're given a price in dollars for a certain year, the equivalent price in dollars for a different year is just take that starting year and then multiply it by the CPI ratio that's going to give you the new year divided by the starting year, right? So if you want to know how much something costs in $2,000 based on what it cost back in 1970, you would take the price of 1970, you would multiply it by the 2000 CPI divided by the 1970 CPI, because that's going to tell you basically what percentage everything's gone up. So you're basically multiplying this by this inflation rate, and that'll give you the new dollar amount for the new year. So here's an example, baseball salaries. In 87, the average salary for Major League Baseball players was $412,000. It's a lot of money back in 1987. It's a lot of money even today. In 2016, it was 4.38 million. Wow. Compare the two salaries in 2016 dollars. How does the rise in baseball salaries compare to the overall rise in prices with inflation? So we can convert the 87 salary of 412,000 into 2016 dollars. So we start with the 1987 amount, multiply it by the ratio of 2016 over 1987, which is 240 over 113.6. Remember, these CPIs you get from a table. You multiply it by that ratio, and you get that $412,000 in 87 would be equivalent to making 870,000 in 2016. Now, according to the rise in the cost of living, a salary of 412 would be 870, and you can see that the actual salary of 4.3 is about 5 times what it would have been if the average salary had just risen with inflation. So obviously, the pay has gone up a lot more than just based on inflation. Okay, and that's basically index numbers.